Well, hello, good morning. I think we're live now. We had a little bit of a technical glitch this morning, but hopefully we've worked through that. And those of you who have decided to join us this Saturday morning for the Quilt Documentation Day, sponsored by the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina and supported with a grant from the South Carolina Arts Commission. So these are your dollars at work. Thank you for joining us. Let's see. Should I give us a minute for folks to be on? So any of you who were part of our, happy Commencement Day. Yes, it is Commencement Day. And I will try to end a little early so that any of you who might be wanting to try to join the USC Commencement, which will be streamed live on the USC Facebook page, that is happening at noontime today. So you'll want to perhaps do that. And meanwhile, I have had a great month since last month, Quilt Documentation Day, doing more research on the log cabin pattern and the Underground Railroad quilts. Hey, Lisa, I'm glad to see you. So yeah, those of you who were part of last month's Quilt Documentation Day program and participated with us, you might recall that the last question, or one of the last questions posed, was about the Underground Railroad quilts. And I just thought, okay, that's an amazing topic. And it really deserved a lot more attention than I could give it at the end of a program. So just, by coincidence, we had a member of our community. Her name is Debbie Greenlaw, and she's from Prosperity. And she had sent me a quilt right after that program that she had inherited through her husband's family. And it's pictured here on the Facebook Live program right now. And it is a log cabin quilt in the barn raising pattern. And since, the log cabin quilt pattern was one of those quilt patterns that many quilt scholars think was a part of the Underground Railroad quilt code, it seemed really fortuitous that somebody would send me that quilt pattern. So today what I would like to do is begin talking specifically about this quilt and what we know about this quilt, and sort of segue into how it relates to, the history of that quilt pattern, the log cabin pattern, but then how it may have figured within the Underground Railroad quilt code. And then we are very fortunate that there are two people in our community, a husband and wife, Jerry Griggs and Denise Lau, who have been collecting quilts, and Denise herself is a quilt maker. So they have been sharing images of the quilts they've collected and that Denise has made since the 1980s with me. And so after we talk about the log cabin quilt and the Underground Railroad quilt scholarship, we'll kind of torque a little bit and review the historical quilts that Jerry and Denise have shared with me, and hopefully I can bring it full circle back to the Underground Railroad quilt code. So this quilt that you're seeing now belongs to Debbie Greenlaw, and the family history that's associated with it is that it was likely made, and again, we're still doing the genealogical research on this, but we know that it came through an aunt who said her mother had made this. So it would have been a grandmother of the woman who gave it to Debbie Greenlaw. And we think it was Abigail Frost Libby, who lived from 1843 to 1899. And she was married to, and she was from Maine. So she was born, lived, died in Maine. So this is a Maine quilt, New England quilt. But it's not unlike many quilts that were made around the country at about this time. And I'm going to date it circa 1880 to 1910, maybe in the latter, this color scheme in particular was very popular, 1890 to 1910, in terms of the cool colors and the black center in the log cabin pattern. So she likely made it during that period. She passed away in 1899, so she would have made it, towards the end of her life. And her life story is kind of interesting. I was able to learn a little bit about what her life experience had been. Her husband's name was Roscoe Libby, and he lived from 1842 to 1880. So he passed away pretty young, 38 years old. And the newspaper in that area of Maine noted in their obituary that he had passed away from heart disease while shingling a roof. And another article in the newspaper a little earlier had praised him as having been a very efficient superintendent of the Portland Packing Company, which was a lobster factory in Oceanville, Maine. So, so I am, and when he passed away, you know, he was 38 years old, and he would have left Abigail, his wife, with 2 young children. And my guess would be that, yeah, that she probably didn't have the bandwidth. We don't know how she managed to raise her family without a husband after he passed away. But we do know that she made. We think we know she made this quilt, and probably towards the end of her life. So so that's what we know about this quilt in particular. But like I said earlier, it's very similar to many silk log cabin quilts that were made in this era. And again, Amanda, we have Amanda Ballou, our McKissick's communications manager, facilitating this program. Amanda, could we show them the next couple of slides of this particular quilt? This is a corner of it. And you can see that, again, the predominant color scheme are cool. And there's a black square at the center of the quilt. And then there's this red border and yeah, this red ruffle that was hand stitched on. And it's also backed in red. Could we see the next image? Yeah. So, so in talking with Debbie, we kind of wondered if perhaps the ruffle and the backing were added at a later time. This was foundation pieced, which was a very common technique for log cabin quilts to be made in. So what you would have is a piece of muslin or some other fabric that wasn't very valuable as the ground. So they would stitch the pieces of silk, wool, you know, satins, velvets, different weights of fabric, which, you know, are hard to piece without a foundation and stay much more stable when there is a backing on it. And so we think maybe this was foundation pieced, and then somebody else added the back and this really swell ruffle in the red that doesn't quite go. I mean, you know, from an aesthetic point of view, Debbie was like, you know, that red just, you know, there's not a lot of red in the quilt. It's mostly cool colors. So how and why it was finished off with this red cotton backing, not a silk or satin backing, but a cotton backing, and then this silk ruffle. So that's this particular quilt. And again, the history, I know some of you who had contacted me between last month and this month were very interested in this pattern and the history of this pattern, because it is one of the most popular patterns in the world of quilting. I mean, I know it was the second quilt I ever made, you know, so it was a quilt pattern that was very popular in the 19th century, became most popular during and after the Civil War, which is why many people associate it with the log cabin president of that time, which was Abe Lincoln. But, you know, earlier presidents had also been called log cabin presidents. So Harrison was a president who was called a log cabin president. So, but we think because of the popularity that this particular pattern enjoyed, starting, we have earliest references around 1863. So, and by the late 1860s, 1870s, this pattern is already a category in the agricultural fairs around the country and even in the southeastern United States. So, so it kind of entered the public imagination, associated in some cases with the log cabin President Lincoln. And although, again, the pattern, you know, Debbie Greenlaw herself is a weaver, and she was telling me how there's a weaving pattern that's very similar in terms of the light dark, the way in which this particular, the log cabin pattern, you know, takes advantage of a square that's made of half light fabrics and half dark that are can be arranged in multiple ways to create very different visual effects. Amanda, could we go back to the full image of this particular quilt? so that people can see, yeah, this. So again, the history of this pattern is a mystery. We think there are multiple histories. Somebody who contacted me just this past week, Peggy Bennett, if she's on here, I don't know if Peggy's on here. Her family's from the Isle of Man, off the coast of the British Isles, and there is this tradition called the Manx quilt that is foundation pieced, and again, very much similar. It is like the log cabin pattern that we know and love in America. This pattern is also called in the British Isle the Canadian log pattern. So again, associated with the frontier, oftentimes when people would make homes out of log cabin homes. And what's interesting about this particular setting of it, there are different settings of these blocks, right? And so this one happens to be called the barn raising. So the other patterns are sunshine and shadow, courthouse steps. We don't know for sure because we can't talk to the people who came up with these names, and they stuck. But the barn raising design refers very specifically to a kind of tradition of a work party in the historical early years of North America, where the community would invite a lot of the men from around the area to come to one particular person's home over the period of a couple days to raise the frame of a barn, literally. And what was fascinating for me to learn, because I never realized this, so I knew that this barn raising pattern kind of referenced that tradition of raising the barn, right? But that often in the southeastern United States, in the antebellum period, at these barn raisings, so part of what happened, because the barn raisings were a social event as well as a work party, sort of like the quilting bee or quilting party, and it was the male equivalent. But often they would take a straw poll at these barn raisings, where the men in the community would vote, take a vote, a pre-vote on which candidate, whether it was mayor, governor, representative, president, whatever election was coming up, and it was reported in the newspapers. So barn raisings were reported in the newspapers in South Carolina and the Southeast as moments and occasions when the popularity of certain kinds of political candidates were kind of gauged and assessed. And whether the woman or women who came up with the name of barn raising for this particular quilting pattern were riffing off that, we don't know. We can't know for sure, but I thought it was really interesting that that there was that history here in the Southeast of barn raisings having very political kind of dimensions to them, social dimensions, political dimensions, et cetera. Trying to think here. So again, the history of this pattern is very complex and diverse. One other theory about where this design came from and became popularized is that in the early part of the 19th century, or 20th century, there was a kind of a craze for all things Egyptian, as Egyptian pyramids were being unearthed, tombs were being unearthed. There were mummies that were discovered that had that were covered and wrapped in cloth, strips of cloth, very, very similar to the log cabin pattern. So we think that that pattern and that way of assembling strips of fabric is indeed very, very, very old, and may go back many, many centuries, more than the history of North America and the British Isles, because we do have images and examples of log cabin quilt patterns from England as early as the 1830s. But yeah, it came into currency in the United States in the 1860s and has, I think, never waned. So having established that, how do we bring this quilt that was made in Maine back to thinking about and talking about the question that was raised last month about, Underground Railroad quilts and what do we know about that? So I wanted to share with you, and I can put this, we'll post this on the Facebook page. I mean, there's a lot of scholarship that's been done on the history of African-American quilts and slave-made quilts. Just a few are Signs and Symbols by Maud Wallman. Stitched from the Soul, Slave Quilts from the Antebellum South by Gladys Marie Fry. We've got a book called Always There, The African American Presence in American Quilts by Questa Benberry. And there's a really interesting article in Uncoverings, which is the Journal of the American Quilt Study Group. In 2004, Barbara Brackman, whose books I've referenced a lot on this program because she has written extensively about the history of quilt patterns. But she wrote this article called Rocky Road to Analysis, Interpreting Quilt Patterns, where she kind of teases out just how hard it is to be really, well, to prove, what these quilt names meant to the people who chose to make quilts out of those patterns. It's just really, really hard to confirm. And the last book, and that's the one we'll talk about mostly, or I'll talk about mostly today, is Hidden in Plain View, A Secret Story of Quilts and the Underground Railroad. And here, this was by Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond Dobart. And, for better or for worse, most of what we know about the history of African-American quilts and slave-made quilts come through documentation that was done by mostly Euro-Americans. So this is the one book that documents, and here I have to thank also Sandy Benjamin, who's an African-American quilter in our community. She and I had a conversation about this because I was curious to see from her point of view, what did this particular book mean for her, and how did she interpret the findings of this particular book? Because this book focuses on an oral history, an oral tradition that was captured by a Euro-American journalist, Jacqueline Tobin. She went to Charleston, and she met through the Charleston market downtown a African-American quilter named Ozella McDaniel Williams. And over a period of years, Ms. Williams shared with Ms. Tobin what she called the Underground Railroad Quilt Code. And she had an extensive story about what patterns in her family history. So within the griot tradition in African-American culture, there is often a family member or members who serve as the keeper of the stories. And it's clear that Ozella took on that role in her own family. And then she decided that this was the moment when she met with Jacqueline to share that. Over time, it wasn't immediate, but over a period of years, she shared what had come through her family history as quilt patterns that were used to code messages on the Underground Railroad. So here I'm showing you, the first page. This is in the book, and there are other patterns. Could you show the next pattern, next page, Amanda, please? Because the log cabin quilt pattern is clearly one of the patterns that was identified by Ozella, through this oral tradition that was part of the code. I'm looking here at the questions going on. Okay, Ms. Silkman, how did they line up the strips so perfectly? Well, that's a technical question. I can address that separately. Let me just keep going on with this because I think this is really interesting. So again, this particular book came under quite a bit of critique by quilt historians because some of the quilt patterns that are documented in this oral tradition in this particular family we don't have evidence of them having been used or in the public, having been used in the antebellum period. And so how do we make sense of that? Well, I don't know, any of you all who played a game, where you play telephone, you start, you're in a circle and you start telling a story or a sentence at one end and it goes around, and by the 10th person, right, the initial story or the initial sentence is transformed. Well, it's not hard for me to imagine that within this family tradition, oral tradition, that more contemporary pattern names would have been incorporated into this story that this family was preserving in order to keep alive this memory of quilts having served as a visual clue to the Underground Railroad codes. I would say codes because we know from other scholarship that songs, certain kinds of drumming patterns, there were all kinds of ways that enslaved peoples, communicated with each other and with people who were conductors on the Underground Railroad in order to evade capture, but to communicate with each other over time and in space. So anybody who's really interested, in this, I think should, take a look at this book. And certainly this book has inspired many contemporary African-American quilters to reinterpret these patterns and use them to visually reference what we think, again, was a way in which enslaved Africans, communicated with each other and other people, on the Underground Railroad, perhaps in a more localized way. Sandy Benjamin, when I asked her about this, she was of the opinion that she calls it Ms. Ozella's code because there's no historical evidence. I mean, no other narrative by an enslaved person who had been on the Underground Railroad or participated in it has ever mentioned these quilt patterns as having been part of their understanding of a visual code used by enslaved peoples during the antebellum period. So we don't have any corroborating documentation. And yet I think, Sandy Benjamin's point that it's quite possible that this was a localized within the low country of South Carolina, or even, in South Carolina or along the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, that it might have been a code that was current among them and perhaps did not span beyond that geographic region and was unique to that area. So yeah, I guess, my own personal thinking about this is that, it's incredibly valuable and important to respect the oral traditions that have survived in many African-American families as a kind of survival tool and technique. And I think, what I hope it inspires is for us to keep looking and keep doing the research on what quilting and quilt making traditions meant and how they unfolded within antebellum culture. Now that more granular research can be done on the experiences of, again, enslaved Africans in and around the United States, North America, there is other evidence. And I just wanted to point to one or two things because in the Camden, South Carolina Journal, June 25th, 1850, there's an article entitled "The Rights and Duties of the Patrol." And it was an article that documents a court case where the defendants had been convicted of violating a particular act that forbid persons from beating or hitting enslaved peoples for being in public or gathering, unduly punishing them. And the incident, I mean, again, it's very complicated to kind of unpack what happened. What seems to have happened is that there was a planter family that had given the enslaved people on its plantations had granted them permission to host a quilting party at their plantation. And they had made sure that all the enslaved peoples who were coming from other places, there was a group of women and men, included women and men, coming from other places, had letters of permission from their owners to be able to participate in this quilting gathering, which from the point of view of the planter class of people was to be encouraged because it supposedly, let's see here, the article talks about it was a custom of the higher class. So this was something that, plantation owners approved of. It was an activity that they sanctioned. And so what had happened was that these enslaved persons were in the kitchen of this plantation having a quilting party, very civil, and this patrol of men, white men, came in and beat them. And the master of the plantation took them to court for having done this. And the court record talks about the Stono Rebellion. It speaks to the ways in which, after that insurrection in the 18th century had occurred, this bloody insurrection that where slaves took, they revolted. And after that, there were much stricter rules about how many African Americans or enslaved peoples could gather. There were restrictions on their use of drumming, on their use of any loud instrument to communicate over space and time. So there were these, again, stricter rules enacted. But the court in this case ruled that these men who were members of this patrol had acted improperly and against the law. And the article that you can read documents their appeal and then their denial. So there was a small victory here, if you can call it that, for the plantation owner who took these men to task for having violated the law, and a small victory for the enslaved Africans who were beaten for having had the law stand up, be held holding these men accountable for disobeying the law. And for, you think about, what's happening, in the contemporary context where there's, there's talk about, how African-American men in particular, but also women, are accused of, driving while black or that sort of thing. But this was in the 19th century, prior to the Civil War, and this particular group of enslaved Africans who were at a quilting party gathering, were beaten, for having traveled and quilting while black. I mean, that's pretty much how it worked. And at least, again, the men in the patrol who tended to be of a lower class than the planter class, they were punished and their appeal was rejected. So that's kind of a neat thing. Let's see here. Oh, fun fiction. Lisa Lamfer shares that there's a fun fiction book called Runaway Quilt by Jennifer Chiaverini about quilts and the Underground Railroad connection. So at any rate, I just thought I would share that with you all because to me it was just striking that how complicated a picture it shows, because the case that people want to make with the Underground Railroad quilts and the codes and all is that enslaved Africans were always trying to find ways to be free, and for some historical moments, the masters of the plantation were encouraging things like quilting gatherings because they perceived it as being imitation of the higher classes. And so they sanctioned these gatherings. But clearly, this was an opportunity, and the women on that plantation who proposed and organized this particular quilting party may have had very different intentions, and gathering together enslaved people from different plantations was an opportunity to share information, to perhaps, again, codify the code that Ozella Williams talks about. And again, look, it's, again, I can go on about how complicated this sort of incident was, but I think it speaks to something that, that we didn't know about, or I didn't know about, certainly, and is not part of the historical record at this point about the history of quilts in South Carolina, and could be and probably should be. There are also other opportunities, and this is not antebellum, but again, I was looking for Southern connections and Southern examples of silk log cabin quilts. And I found that in the Charlotte, North Carolina Democrat newspaper on November 14th, 1879, the silver cup, the top prize at the fair there, was awarded to Elizabeth Lomax, who is, in parentheses, colored, for her silk log cabin quilt. So I haven't had time to dig down and do genealogical research on Elizabeth Lomax yet, but I just think that there's a lot of information out there that we can continue to research in order to better understand just how quilts figured in the lives of enslaved African Americans, but also recently freed African Americans. And so this quilt that I showed you that was made in Maine, you know, the same kind of quilt could possibly have been made in Charlotte, North Carolina, or at least documented in Charlotte, North Carolina, by an African American woman who won the first prize silver cup at the state fair. So that being said, let's move to the next image. I'm shifting here to the quilts that Jerry Griggs and Denise Lau shared with me. And I chose this one first because of the wheel. Within the Underground Railroad quilt code that Ozella Williams shared with us, the wheel takes on a very important significance as something that, again, allows people to travel. You know, swing low, sweet chariot. It's that wheel. It's that moving. It's transportation. It's being able to move across space in time. So I thought this was an interesting pattern, you know, quilt to follow up with. It's sashed with this bright, you know, pink fabric. Next image, please, Amanda. So I think you probably can't see this. It's hard to see. I saw it on my screen when I was able to enlarge it, but the quilter decided she really liked that pink fabric and liked the pink color. And what she chose to do in the extraordinary quilting on this piece is to quilt it in pink. So you can see up close this, you know, the quilting pattern really shows up in the pink thread. So I thought that was a really interesting choice that the quilter made to take advantage of color to foreground the sculptural dimension of this piece. Next image, please. Yeah, you can kind of see, this is again another picture of the back of the quilt, where you can see the pink. There's a little bit of a contrast, pink thread against the white, off-white fabric. Beautiful, beautiful quilting stitches. So this person was very proud of their stitching ability. Nice, even, beautiful, small stitches, and used the pink thread to foreground that. Next one. Okay, this is a Dresden plate pattern. And again, the person who made this had a she was very skilled at hand quilting. And so there's a lot of negative space in this particular quilt, a lot of, meaning white, you know, a solid color where the quilting would really, really, really show up. Next slide, please, or next image. This, I wanted to show you how in the border, the quilter made a very conscious choice to alternate the blue. It looks like the same kind of fabric in blue and in pink, and they alternated the pink and the blue to create a visual rhythm in the border. Next image. Oh, and on the back of this one too, there is a printed, you know, stamped message as part of the backing fabric, and it says pointer cloth, guaranteed fast color, and it looks like USFCO. I did a little research and could not find anything on the internet about pointer cloth. So if any of you all know anything about pointer cloth, or we should crowdsource this to see if we can come up with where this fabric might have been made and come from. But you can see the quilting here is quite exquisite. Again, this particular quilt really showcases amazing hand stitching. Next image, please. This is the snowball quilt that we've seen, I think, for the past 3 months. We've had examples of the snowball quilt pattern. Again, very popular pattern all over the country. I showed you last month the newspaper article that very much specified, what color waves to use, solids versus prints, and gave you the pattern. But this, again, lots of white background so that it becomes for the quilter who wants a kind of to showcase the hand quilting. Next image, please. You can see, look at this quilting here. The quilting is just extraordinary. Much more complicated, I think, than any of the other snowballs that I've seen. And I think Jerry and Denise have an eye for quilts that have a lot of negative space, as they say in art history. So a lot of blank space on which the sculptural dimension of the quilt can really be showcased. Next image. Okay, I love this one because, you look at it and you go, blue and white, and with that orange border. What, did they run out of the blue fabric? And not the case. The name of this pattern is Robbing Peter to Pay Paul. So, and it's, again, a pattern that was very popular among quilters in the 30s, 40s. Next image, please. I didn't realize it until I looked really closely, and I don't think you can probably see this on the Facebook Live presentation. Maybe the next image. The quilting is, no, go back, please. Okay, so you can't see it, but I can, and I did on a detail of this. The quilter chose on the blue fabric. The quilting pattern is very simple. It's just a grid. It's a straight grid all over the quilt, but on the blue fabrics, the quilter used orange thread. So you get this incredible minimalist kind of popping of this orange thread on the blue fabrics. That's just stunning when you see it up close. And then on the white fabric, she used white thread. So, I mean, this changing of the thread, making that self-conscious choice to bring the orange from the border into the blue fabrics, onto the blue fabrics through the sculptural dimension of this quilt. It's really sophisticated, really, really sophisticated. Next image. Okay, so this is, we've seen wedding ring quilts, back in June. I think even last month we started with an unusual setting and color wave of the wedding ring quilt. This one is a little unusual because typically where the double wedding rings come together, the quilter would use mostly pink and blue, blocks to visually kind of bring to focus the corners of the double wedding rings. In this particular instance, the quilter chose to leave them blank. So again, guess what? It's an opportunity for this particular maker to showcase the sculptural dimension of this quilt. Next image, please. So you can see just how intensely this is quilted. There's a feathered, a circle with a grid with a feathered pattern in the center. And then each of the places where typically there's a 4 patch of blue and pink fabrics, this one is left blank for more quilting. So this one's just, again, exquisitely hand quilted and really a showcase piece for whoever made it. Next image. Okay, I love this quilt because I think in terms of provenance, the other quilts were purchased, one in Chattanooga, some at an antique mall here in Columbia. This one was from Simpsonville. So I'm not sure. I'll have to talk with Denise and Jerry about exactly, where, how, and how clear the provenance is connected to Simpsonville, but it's a utilitarian quilt that, if you all remember, last month we talked about mosaic quilts and the use of the hexagon. Well, this particular quilt starts out with a hexagon and then, uses scraps, and then has a really interesting border, which we'll see in a minute. But I wanted you to look at, while we have the full image of it here, the clamshell quilting starts from each end going towards the middle, and then it's just cross-hatched in the middle. So I don't know, how they did that, but it's really interesting. And because it clearly was a utilitarian quilt, I think, there's a lot of batting inside, so you get a puffiness there. You can really see the clamshell quilting. It was made to keep somebody warm. Next image, please. And I wanted to showcase the border fabric because it has a Dresden plate in it. I don't know how much you can see of it, but the Dresden plate was just a very, very popular pattern because Dresden plates were in fashion. And it was printed on fabric, and then it became popular as a quilt pattern during the 30s and 40s, very much so. Next image. And I wanted to just show you, this is a 34, I think, newspaper article. Nancy Page, she shows us this particular pattern. Yeah, 1934, Nancy Page. She shares this particular pattern, and she credits a Mrs. Craig of Doylestown, Ohio, for sharing this. So in the newspapers of the time, women would send in patterns that they were using, and the Nancy Page, and this appeared in the Evening Star in Washington D.C. She would publish it, and she calls it hexagon stars. So I just thought it was very interesting to be able to kind of link again how it had entered the popular culture, at least printed wise, by 1934, and then this example coming from Simpsonville, North Carolina. Which I think is just wonderful because of the use of color. I mean, the use of the beige kind of brownish color as the background instead of muslin was a really interesting choice, and I think serves the quilt very well. Next image. So I wanted to end today's program with an image of the corner of a quilt that Denise Lau actually made herself. So. And like I said at the beginning, I thought this was an interesting quilt to kind of tie back to the Underground Railroad quilt code, because this is a variation of the flying geese pattern, which is one of those quilt patterns that Ozella Williams identifies as an important part of the Underground Railroad quilt code. One, because it indicates flight, moving over space, and that in real life, escaping enslaved peoples would often look at where the geese were going, because they would often lead them to sources of water. So it was very much a kind of cue for that kind of survival technique that enslaved people who were escaping on the Underground Railroad were using. This particular quilt was made by Denise, and it kind of documents her moving. So in 1982, she moved from Hawaii to South Carolina. And this was a quilt that she made. I don't want to say about that journey, but it certainly represents that transition in time, space, place, culture. So she used Hawaiian quilt fabrics, as well as some check fabrics, and we can't see them in the detail here, but that visually reference the farm workers, what the clothing that farm workers on Hawaii, the islands of Hawaii, would have worn. So I thought it was a really nice image to end with, and say that next month, what I'll do is I will share a body of work by her, because they were good enough to share that with me. So she is in some ways representative of the quilt revival that happened after 1976. I kind of date that as the time the bicentennial was a big push for reviving quilts, along with the women's movement and Back to the Land movement. So next week, or next month rather, we will have a look at the body of work that Denise made when she came to South Carolina as part of the last quarter of the 20th century quilt revival that happened, again, all over this country, and I think continues pretty much unabated today. So does anybody have any questions about anything I've talked about today? Looking here. Oh, Drusilla's here too. Hey, Drusilla, good morning. And Anita, great to hear from you all. Do you all have anything to add in terms of your own experiences of working with the log cabin pattern, or any of these particular quilt patterns that I've shared with you today? Would love to hear from you all, and I'll wait a few seconds, to kind of see if anybody writes anything, because I know we've got some real, I know Anita has been, part of the leadership for the, Quilters of South Carolina and the local guild. I mean, she's made a lot of quilts, and probably has experience with making a lot of these quilts. Well, I don't see that there's anybody asking a question yet. So I guess, to end today, like I said, I would like to thank everybody who made today possible. Debbie Greenlaw, Jerry Griggs, Denise Lau, Sandy Benjamin, Amanda Ballou, and the South Carolina Arts Commission. And I would say, yeah, if you have a Carolina graduating, please go on to Facebook, the university Facebook, for the noontime live stream of graduation, and put September 12th on your calendar, and be sure to encourage people that again, it can be contemporary quilters wanting to document their own body of work, and send me some images that I can share out with you all, because this program is really not very lively if I'm not getting anything from you all, because it's your quilts, it's your understanding of quilt history, together with mine, that is making for this program, this Facebook Live program. Let's see here. Yeah, we have the form. I mean, Amanda's putting up the form again. The original form, we forgot to put a line for the name of the quilter, which was a real omission, because of course we're really very curious about who the maker was, and we want to make sure that we recognize the names of people, of quilt makers whose names we know, because a lot of them we don't know, and can't really, it's hard to identify. So we really want to call out the names of the quilters that we do know. So in documenting them for the Folklife Resource Center. So again, thank you all for being part of this. I hope that as we continue on, it will be more of a conversation than me just talking. But again, if any of you are interested in researching with me some of these articles that I'm turning up on the internet, I think there's a lot we can learn. It's sometimes, again, very frustrating, especially in the case of trying to tease out the history of African American quilting in North America, because of the lens that Euro-Americans brought to the activities of African Americans. And so one of the things that I was struck with, and I don't have time here today to discuss this extensively, but it seemed that quilting gatherings, African American families, women were hosting them well into the 20th century, from the 19th century into the 20th century. But the only time they made news, because Euro-American quilting parties, made news, and it was always, so we, this group of people met at this woman's house, and they had a nice dinner or nice refreshments, and it was all very lovely. And the times that African American quilt gatherings make it into the newspapers in South Carolina, at any rate, are when there's a killing, a murder, somebody shoots somebody. So the ways in which quilting within the African American community gets represented in the public eye focuses on the violence, on quilting as the site of violence, and it really skews, I think, in a very big way, and in a very way that's really racist. I don't know how else you would call it, but that really focuses on the kind of violence that occurred at some quilting parties. I mean, I can't help but think that kind of violence probably occurred at Euro-American quilting parties as well, when people drank too much, because they were often places or times when there was alcohol served. But the way in which, African American quilting parties only seem to appear when somebody's being shot at or hurt, really is disturbing. And then there's some really sad reporting of African American women who are quilting with their backs to fires. There are several of those in the newspaper where their clothing catches fire and they are burned, and it's not a very happy story. On the other hand, again, there are, I found a woman who, I think it was 1878 or 79, an African-American woman won a prize for 2 crazy quilts that she submitted to the Sumter Agricultural Fair, the colored fair in Sumter County. And she, not only did she win a prize for her 2 crazy quilts, but I was able to find out that she was also among the leadership of starting the fair. So she was part of the organizing committee of this fair to really raise up, what accomplishments African Americans in the Sumter County area were doing in their communities. And she also was a teacher. So there was documentation of her graduating from a teacher's college and then teaching in a school. So we have evidence of these African-American women who were quilters, but incredible leaders in their communities as well. So, so more to come. And thank you for being with us today. And stay safe. COVID is still with us. And for the time being, we'll still be doing these quilt documentation days via Facebook Live. I look forward to seeing what you all send. Thank you for being here with me. It's really heartening to have you all be part of this. Thank you.